Hi, I'm the History Guy. I love history, and if you love history too, this is the channel for you. Do you remember that naval accident where 20 civilians were injured, 6 people were killed, 2 of them U.S. cabinet secretaries, and the president's future father-in-law? You would think that if something like that happened, you'd remember it. But it did, and not too many Americans do remember it, even though it is one of the most significant events in American history. And so today we are going to talk about the Princeton disaster of 1844. The Princeton was a marvel, a steam sloop of the United States Navy. She was the first U.S. Navy vessel to be driven by a steam-powered screw propeller. She was the fastest ship in the fleet and one of the most advanced in the world. She was designed by engineering genius John Erickson with the help of Navy Captain Robert Stockton, who was a politically connected naval officer who believed in modernizing the fleet and had the political pull to pull the strings to get a ship like this built. February 28, 1844, the Princeton was fully outfitted and ready to sail, and so she was taken on a pleasure demonstration cruise down the Potomac. Guests included President John Tyler, members of his cabinet, former First Lady Dolly Madison, and 200 other guests. And while they cruised, they could enjoy demonstrations of the Princeton's 2 huge 12-inch main guns, the Oregon and the Peacemaker, either of which could throw a 200-pound cannonball 5 miles. On the last demonstration of the day, disaster struck. The breech of the Peacemaker exploded, throwing shrapnel into the crowd. 6 people were killed and 20 injured. The dead included the U.S. Secretary of State, Abel P. Upshur, Secretary of the Navy, Thomas Walker Gilmore, and New York State Senator David Gardner, father of Julie Gardner, President Tyler's fiancée. The cause of the accident was really jealousy. While it seemed like Erickson and Stockton were a great team, in fact, Stockton was jealous of Erickson and trying behind the scenes to steal credit for many of his innovations. Erickson had designed the Oregon, and he designed it using built-up construction, which is a process that puts hot steel rings around the base of the gun it's being created, in order to give it much more strength at the breech. The Peacemaker, on the other hand, was made by Stockton, and while he stole some of Erickson's designs, he didn't understand built-up construction. He used cast iron, and he solved the problem just by making the cast iron thicker at the breech. That made a more impressive-looking gun, but it had the problem of all cast iron guns. Cast iron cannot stand the transverse forces of the explosion. Simply put, because of the design, the Peacemaker breech was going to explode at some point. Because of his political connections, Stockton was able to avoid responsibility in the court of inquiry and actually tried to pass blame to Erickson, despite the fact that Erickson had nothing to do with the building of the gun Peacemaker. Erickson was disgusted, no longer trusted the Navy, and the program for modernizing the Navy was halted, setting the Navy back at least a decade. John Erickson, the greatest naval engineer of his day, refused to work with the U.S. Navy again for 17 years until he was begged to by the Lincoln administration during the Civil War, when of course he produced his revolutionary design for the USS Monitor. But the most immediate effect was on the presidential election of 1844, and that was because of the death of Abel P. Upshur. Upshur was a fantastic politician, and he had just worked through delicate negotiations with the parties of the day, the Whigs, the Democrats, and Sam Houston in Texas, to bring Texas into the Union, Texas statehood, before the end of John Tyler's administration. That deal died with Upshur, especially since his replacement, John C. Calhoun, managed to alienate the Whigs. That was important because Texas statehood was John Tyler's big argument for re-election, and when the deal fell through, his popularity declined, his odds of re-election declined, and he ended up not even running in 1844. But it also impacted the Democratic nomination. Because of Upshur's death, the annexation of Texas was a major issue in the campaign of 1844, and that caused the Democrats to shift away from their original favored candidate, former President Martin Van Buren, who opposed expansion, to move to a pro-expansion candidate, the dark horse James K. Polk, and that allowed the Democrats to attract the former John Tyler voters to the Democratic Party. And then Polk won the 1844 election against the Whig nominee, Henry Clay, on the issue of Texas expansion. And so were it not for the explosion aboard the Princeton, our 11th president, James K. Polk, would not even have been nominated, more or less elected. The explosion determined the election of 1844. So how important was James K. Polk? Well, despite the fact that he only served for one term, the Polk administration was actually extremely impactful. Polk's support for manifest destiny and expansionist ideas directly impacted the map of the nation through things like the acquisition of the Oregon Territory. But maybe more powerfully, it was his pressing for expansion and direct acts of James K. Polk as president that led us to war with Mexico in 1846. And the Mexican-American War had huge impacts in both the United States and in Mexico, directly through things like the acquisition of California and the American Southwest. The map of the United States is what it is today because of the election of James K. Polk. But the war with Mexico also exacerbated the sectarian divisions that would eventually lead 15 years later to the U.S. Civil War. Ulysses Grant, who famously fought in both the Mexican War and the Civil War, argued that the U.S. Civil War, the pivotal moment in U.S. history that cost 750,000 American lives, was the direct consequence of the war with Mexico, which was the consequence of the election of James K. Polk, which was the consequence of the explosion aboard the Princeton in February of 1844. Rarely in history has a moment, one brief instant in time, so profoundly impacted the direction of a people and a nation. And that is why you should remember the Princeton disaster of 1844. I'm the History Guy, and I hope you enjoyed this edition of my series of short snippets of forgotten history about 10 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button, which is there on your left. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. And if you'd like more snippets of forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.